He fired her. Not because she had done something wrong, not because her work was poor or her conduct improper. Nikola Tesla fired a secretary simply because she wore a pearl necklace to work. She came in, he saw them, and she was gone before the day was done. This is documented. This is not myth. This is not the embellishment of a man's eccentricities into legend. The fear was real, the pearls were real, and the firing, the complete inability to be in the same room as another human being who happened to be wearing a specific piece of jewelry. That was the architecture of a man whose relationship to certain surfaces, certain textures, certain objects was not merely aversion. It was involuntary. It was total. It was biologically outside his control. And here's what that tells us about the most important thing you think you know about genius. Tesla is remembered as a mind operating at a frequency most humans could not access. The man who lit the world. The architect of alternating current. The inventor who dreamed in electrical equations and woke with solutions already assembled. The narrative of Tesla is always the same. A brain so advanced, it almost could not exist in an ordinary human body. But the pearl necklace changes that story completely. Because what the pearl necklace reveals is not a brain operating above ordinary human limits. It reveals a brain operating inside one of the most primitive systems in all of human neuroscience. A system so ancient, so automatic, and so impossible to override that it does not care how intelligent you are. It does not pause for genius. It does not yield to reason. It fires before you have had a single conscious thought. And by the time you understand what has happened, the decision is already made. Tesla did not choose to fear pearls. He could not choose to stop. And the reason why, the mechanism behind it, is the same mechanism running inside your brain right now, deciding, without your permission, what is safe and what is not. You have no more control over that process than he did. That is not a metaphor. That is the neuroscience. The structure doing this is called the amygdala. Two almond-shaped clusters of neurons buried deep in the temporal lobes, one on each side, older than almost anything else in the human brain. The amygdala does not think. It does not deliberate. It pattern matches at a speed the conscious mind cannot approach, roughly 300 milliseconds ahead of your awareness. And it makes a single binary judgment, threat or not threat. When it detects what it has been trained to detect as a threat, it fires the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Cortisol and adrenaline release in milliseconds. Heart rate climbs. Peripheral vision narrows. Muscles tense in preparation for action the conscious mind has not yet decided to take. Blood is already leaving the digestive system and arriving in the large muscle groups before you have formed a single word about what you are experiencing. Tesla, standing at the entrance to his office, sees the pearls. His amygdala fires. His body is already in distress before his conscious mind has translated the visual information into the thought. Pearls. The woman has to leave. Not because he wants her to, because his nervous system has made a decision his rational mind is powerless to reverse in that moment, and the only available action that will reduce the physiological cascade is to remove the trigger. The secretary loses her job. The fear wins. It always wins in that moment. That is what the amygdala was designed to do. But this explanation, accurate as it is, does not answer the deeper question. Why pearls? Arachnophobia makes evolutionary sense. The brain that learned to treat spiders as threats passed that encoding down because the threat was real. The spider that killed the ancestor left no descendants who were indifferent to spiders. Claustrophobia makes sense. The enclosed space, the restricted exit, the inability to flee. The brain that feared that space survived the cave-in that killed the one who did not. Even social anxiety has evolutionary logic. The social hierarchy was life and death. Expulsion from the group was death. The brain that monitored social threat obsessively was the brain that survived. But pearls, round, smooth, nacreous, biologically inert, produced by a mollusk and worn around a human neck. What threat did the ancestor survive by fearing pearls? What mechanism does evolution offer for the brain that chose this as its enemy? The answer is not what you expect. There is a clinical concept called sensory aversion, and it sits at the intersection of two brain systems, the amygdala, which processes threat, and the insula, which processes visceral sensation and disgust. The insula is the structure that makes you recoil from rotting food, from certain textures, from the sight of biological contamination. Its job is not fear exactly. Its job is revulsion, the feeling of wrongness that lives below language and communicates directly to the gut. In certain individuals, the insula and the amygdala become co-activated by stimuli that do not, on the surface, appear dangerous. The object does not need to have caused real harm. The object does not need to be associated with pain. The object only needs to have been present at sufficient proximity during a moment when the brain registered something: stress, overwhelm, threat, trauma, and the encoding process locked the two things together. This is called conditioned fear acquisition. And once the lock is made, it cannot be simply reasoned open. Tesla's documented sensory sensitivities extended beyond pearls. He could not touch hair. The touch of another person's hair produced a physical reaction he described as almost unbearable: certain fabrics, certain surfaces. The list was not random, but it did not follow the logic of danger. It followed the logic of a nervous system with a specific kind of perceptual acuity, one that registered sensory information at a level of intensity that most brains filter out before it reaches conscious awareness. This is where the story of the pearl necklace stops being about one unusual man and starts being about the brain you are using to read this sentence right now. Because the same process, the same amygdala firing, the same conditioned encoding, the same irreversible locking of object in distress happens to every brain that has ever lived. The trigger changes, the phobia changes. The specific sensory input that the nervous system selected as its enemy changes from person to person with an apparent randomness that has driven researchers to frustration for decades. But the mechanism is identical, which means the question is not why Tesla feared pearls. The question is, what did your brain lock together that you have not yet named? There is something you avoid that you have not fully explained to yourself, a specific texture, or a specific sound, or a specific configuration of objects in a room that produces, before you can stop it, a feeling you can only describe as wrong. You have probably told yourself it is a preference, a quirk, a minor aversion you could push through if you wanted to. You do not think about it much because it does not dominate your life the way Tesla's sensory world dominated his. But the mechanism is already running. The amygdala has already made its decisions. The insula has already registered what it will and will not accept, and filed those judgments in a system that does not accept appeals. You did not choose those judgments. You were not present when they were made. Now consider what Tesla was building across the same years that his nervous system was running this parallel program. The Wardenclyffe Tower, the alternating current system that made electrical power transmission across distance possible. The radio system that predated Marconi's patent claim by enough years to become one of the longest intellectual property disputes in the history of American science. A vision of a wireless world, of energy transmitted through the air itself, of a planet connected not by wires but by resonant frequency. The scale of the cognitive project was extraordinary, and the man executing it could not be in the same room as a pearl necklace. These two facts coexisted without contradiction inside the same brain, inside the same nervous system, inside the same skull, every single day of his working life. The part of his mind that moved at the frequency of alternating current. The part of his nervous system that moved at the frequency of ancient, primitive, involuntary survival computation. Both running simultaneously, both real, neither one canceling the other out. This is what the pearl necklace actually reveals about the relationship between genius and fear. They are not opposites, they are not mutually exclusive. They are not evidence of fragility versus strength. They are evidence that the human brain is not a single unified system operating at one level of sophistication. It is a layered architecture built over hundreds of thousands of years, and the oldest layers do not consult the newest ones before making their decisions. The amygdala does not ask the prefrontal cortex for its opinion. The fear fires before the intelligence can intervene. This means the most extraordinary brain you can build, the brain that rewired electricity, that dreamed the wireless world into existence, that ran on a few hours of sleep and a great deal of the pigeon companionship, and apparently only one specific kind of food for long stretches. That brain cannot override its own ancient infrastructure. Neither can yours. There are researchers who have spent careers attempting to understand what they call the specificity problem of phobia formation, the question of why the amygdala selects one object and not another, why it locks this surface and not that one, why it builds an architecture of avoidance around this precise stimulus, while remaining indifferent to objects that appear, by any rational measure, far more dangerous. The honest answer, as of every published study on conditioned fear acquisition, is that the selection mechanism is not fully understood. We know the encoding happens, we know the lock forms, we know the neurochemical process of how the fear memory consolidates during sleep, how the hippocampus transfers the raw threat assessment of the amygdala into long-term storage, and how that storage becomes more stable, not less, over time, hardening with repetition and avoidance into a structure that is extraordinarily difficult to dismantle. What we do not know is why the amygdala chose this object and not the 10,000 others present in the same environment at the same time. Tesla's fear of pearls was documented during his lifetime and has been noted by virtually every serious biographer since. What has not been fully examined is what it means that the same brain running the phobia was also running the invention. Not despite the phobia, not separated from the phobia by some internal psychological firewall, running both simultaneously as a single integrated system. There is a theory that sits at the margins of sensory neuroscience, not fully accepted, not fully refuted, that the same perceptual hypersensitivity that makes certain brains susceptible to intense sensory aversion also generates the granularity of perception that underlies certain kinds of creative and scientific thinking. That the nervous system sensitive enough to register pearls as threatening is sensitive enough to register electrical field behavior that other observers did not notice. That the heightened processing intensity that makes the fear stronger also makes the observation sharper. This is not an argument that phobia causes genius, or that suffering is the price of brilliance, or any other convenient narrative that makes fear romantic. Tesla's sensory aversions caused him real disruption, real loss, real social isolation. The secretary who lost her job did not gain anything from his perceptual acuity. His phobia was not a gift, it was a misfiring, but the firing was coming from the same hardware. And that is the thing the pearl necklace will not let us look away from. Because the brain that misfires is not a broken brain. It is a brain running exactly as designed. The amygdala that encoded pearls as threatening was not malfunctioning. It was performing its core function: threat detection, rapid response, conditioned encoding for future survival, with complete mechanical precision. The design worked. The system worked. The problem is that the system was designed for an environment that no longer exists, making decisions with a speed and finality appropriate to physical predation, and applying that ancient computation to a pearl necklace in a 20th century office in New York City. The machine ran perfectly. It simply chose the wrong enemy. And that, more than anything Tesla ever invented, tells us something true about what it means to have a human brain. The fear is not the failure. The fear is the feature. It is doing exactly what it evolved to do. The tragedy, the secretary's job, the avoidance, the restructured life, the list of surfaces that cannot be touched. That is not the malfunction. That is the cost of carrying 200,000-year-old machinery into a world it was not designed for. Tesla died in 1943 in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel alone. He had lived his final years in a single hotel room, feeding the pigeons on the windowsill, avoiding almost all human contact, surrounded by the specific sensory environment he had learned to control. The greatest electrical mind of his generation, reduced in his final chapter to the smallest possible world. The one world where the amygdala had no new enemies to find. The fear did not kill him, but it shaped every room he lived in. And somewhere in your brain, right now, there are decisions already made, locks already set, enemies already named in a language below your conscious awareness, in a filing system you cannot open and cannot audit. You do not know what they are, you will not know until you are standing in front of one of them, and by then, the decision will already be made.